Right, let me introduce you to Fuimaono Tuiasau, the chair for today's session.
Aloha everyone, greetings from Auckland, New Zealand, to those who are joining us from across the Pacific and throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand, and even from our friends in Australia. Today we are going to essentially have a session to answer some critical questions about corruption and bribery in the Pacific. The essential question is this, which is something which I think we've all been worried about, is do Pacific people really care about corruption? And if they do, how do they express it, and what are we as Pacific people prepared to do about it? And to answer that question, we have two speakers to unpack this serious issue. We have Mariam Matthews, who currently is in Brisbane. This is how international transparency work is. And we have a dear friend, Joseph Veramu from Fiji, who will give a Pacific perspective about the report that Mariam will speak about. What my role here to do is to essentially be your parking warden, to move you along, to allow you in. And so before I introduce Mariam and Joseph, there are some housekeeping rules I just want everyone to be aware of. Now, all of you are logged into the screen, and you can see at the bottom of your screen, if you just tap onto your screen, there is a Q&A button. So we have an hour to go through the report that Mariam will be speaking to. And while she's talking, or you may have seen parts of the report already, you may have some questions about it, about the report, or some general questions, or some general information questions. Please put your questions in that Q&A box. We'll try and answer the simple ones straight away. And so if you ask a question, hopefully we'll get to your question directly, quickly. But if there's a more substantial question which requires further clarification, I'll ask Mariam to respond. And there's a lot of information to get through. So please, if you're not sure about where your question should come in now, you might want to just wait until later on in the session, because that question might be answered. Now, if there is a substantial question, which I'm going to, you'll have to excuse me, I'm going to make the call on it, whether that's substantial or not, and which should be aired. I'm going to ask that person directly to ask their question, and we have a system here where we can unmute you or mute you, or we can do lots of things here using this technology. Finally, this webinar is going to be recorded, and so that it will be posted on our Transparency International New Zealand website, and so you can access it later on if you need to. There may be some questions which you'll think of later after the session. Again, if that occurs, please write to Transparency International by email, and we'll try and get them answered as quickly as possible. So before we start, can I again welcome everyone? We have, I think on our response list, we have the Chief Ombudsman from Tuvalu. Sir, if you're here, welcome. We have people from Papua New Guinea. To you, welcome. We have people from Fiji and Australia. Welcome to you all. This is an important question. It's an international question, and it's highly relevant in these days where the climate change agenda is looming very, very large for all of us. If the West does something to the Pacific and pours lots of resources into it, is the Pacific ready to monitor and check on how the spending is happening? What are the systems that are available? What processes we can use to and have confidence in that there will be effective reporting and monitoring. So this is the current climate that we're working on. There's a lot of focus on environmental change and the movement of capital across the Pacific. How is this all being monitored? And have we got confidence in our institutions to monitor it? So some of these questions will be answered in Mariam's session. And just to say that I welcome to those who are still joining us. Great to see you. We will, as I said, if you've got a Q&A, please log it in. We'll answer the simple ones quickly, and if there's a substantial one, I'll pick it up and I'll ask that person to ask the question, and we'll unmute you. Now, the report that we are going to be talking about is now public knowledge. It's on Transparency International website, and there's links already from the press release we've had this morning to it. So please have a look at it. It's for my part, I had a look at it last night. It's quite substantial. There's some big issues, but the community around the Pacific have expressed their views, and Mariam's going to tell us what those views are. So, Mariam Matthews is the Pacific Advisor to Transparency International. She's based in Brisbane, and she leads the Transparency International advocacy work and engagement in the region. Her work essentially is to expand partnerships for transparency and openness. And so without further ado, I now welcome Mariam to speak to us. Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so we are very excited to be launching this report finally. It's the Global Corruption Barometer Pacific 2021 report. We really hope that it's going to add value to the anti-corruption movement in the region. And yeah, the findings would be helpful to all. Before we go into the report itself, a little bit about Transparency International itself. We are a global movement of independent national organizations in over 100 countries around the world. And the main focus is to fight corruption. In the Pacific region, we have national chapters in PNG, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, a national contact in Fiji. We have chapters in Australia and New Zealand, and a partner of late in Kiribati as well. And the work that we do really ranges depending on what is relevant to the country context. So right from community awareness, which a lot of our chapters do on corruption issues, to seeking elections integrity, to tracking public government budgets and expenses. And then last year, some of our chapters with the COVID pandemic were also keenly following the spending towards responding to the crisis as well, to make sure that it's transparent and accountable. So it really depends on what is relevant to each country and in that time. Now, what is the GCB Pacific, if you will ask? It is a flagship product of Transparency International. And it is what it is basically a public survey. So it's a survey that asks ordinary people about their everyday experience of corruption in their countries and their views on corruption. So we believe it's a really powerful tool because you get to hear from the people themselves about their direct experience and their perspectives on corruption. And yeah, it's a really powerful form of evidence that can guide reform. We believe previously that the Pacific region has been one of the most understudied when it comes to corruption in the world before. And this report is the first of its kind that is Pacific focused and covers such a large number of countries as it does in the region. Previously, this methodology has been applied by TI to other regions, but this is the first of its kind for the Pacific as a standalone report. The survey covered, we were able to reach over 6,000 Pacific Islanders in 10 countries and territories. using the survey. So we're really pleased about that number. And the 10 countries and territories include Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, French Polynesia, Kiribati, New Caledonia, PNG, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu. We did survey 17 countries in total in the region. And these are essentially all the Pacific Island Forum countries, except for Australia and New Zealand. However, this report only captures the findings from the 10 that I mentioned. The extra 7 will be captured through a second report that we hope to launch sometime next year. And just because they are smaller populations, we wanted to dig deeper into the findings and understand the context around them a little bit more. So please stay tuned for the second report. The 7 countries coming up next year are Nauru, Palau, Marshall Islands, Cook Islands, Niue, Tokelau, and Tuvalu. And the questionnaire itself has been broadly categorized into 3 main areas. 1, we have assessed people's perceptions of corruption. Secondly, their direct experience of corruption. And third, their attitudes towards corruption. And we will go through the findings around these broad categories so you see the kinds of questions they responded to. And just to say, this entire project has been funded by the Australian and New Zealand governments. So on to the findings themselves. What did the Pacific people say? We'll start with the people's perceptions of corruption questions. Firstly, being that people believe that corruption is a big problem in governments, with a regional average of 61% of respondents believing it's a big problem. This is particularly high in Solomon Islands and PNG, with over 90% of the respondents saying that it's a big problem. So that's quite concerning, and in comparison, much lower in the French territories. We also asked about individuals and key institutions, and members of parliament seem to be people perceive them to be most involved in corruption. Secondly, staff in the heads of government offices, and third, police. And if you go down the list, religious leaders were looked at as least corrupt. So it's interesting to see this. We also asked generally about trust in institutions to act responsibly. And you can see that there is a correlation between the previous question and this one, given that religious institutions here are seen as most trusted. But overall, all of the institutions had a majority of respondents saying that they do trust these institutions to act responsibly. So that's good. Perhaps the lowest on the list was governments, but still a majority. So yeah, we found out that corruption is a problem. In addition to that, people believe that there are low prosecution rates of corrupt officials. So the regional average here of respondents was 43%, thinking that corrupt officials never or rarely face consequences. And this was highest in French Polynesia and Tonga, and least in Vanuatu and New Caledonia. So that's quite concerning. We asked about corruption in government, and then we asked about corruption in businesses. And here too, we see that it is a big problem, with a regional average of 56% of respondents believing that corruption in business is a big problem. Once again, Solomon Islands and PNG scored the most problematic in terms of the most number of respondents believing this is a big problem. And the countries or the territories in this case, with the least number of respondents believing it's a problem, were the French, New Caledonia and French Polynesia, so the French territories. A little bit closer looking at the government-business relationships now. We asked about corruption around obtaining government contracts. And here, yes, there was concern. People perceived that there to be, as in businesses to at least occasionally rely on money or connections to obtain government contracts, 68% of the respondents. Solomon Islands again is highest scorer in this regard, thinking that this is a big problem at over 90% of the respondents believing. So FSM also has a high percentage, but then in contrast, New Caledonia has a lesser number of respondents at 37% believing that this is a problem. So you can see the country findings are quite varied on many of these questions. Then we asked about oversight of natural resources, and here 47% of the respondents regionally thought that that there is little control over those who extract natural resources. So this is concerning, and here Kiribati was the highest scorer in terms of the most number of respondents believing that this was an issue. Fiji is also up there at 60%. And then in contrast, the French territories and Samoa had lower ratings around this issue. We also asked about specifically people working for companies in this sector, in the extractive sector. And here 26% of them thought that most or all people working in this sector are corrupt. So it's also an issue to look into at an individual level within companies as well. And then we asked about influence over governments by big interests, by big companies, and 40% of the respondents thought that governments are often run by big interests. So big companies being able to influence government decision-making processes. So that's quite concerning. So those were some of the findings around people's perceptions. And now we will move into their direct experiences of corruption. Starting with access to public services, we asked about bribery rates, and 32% of the respondents across the region thought that of the respondents had to pay a bribe in the last 12 months in order to access public services. So this is also a concerning area, 32%. If you look at the map, the darkest colors are in Micronesia, even though the survey only covered 2 Micronesian countries. So just a note on that. But those two did score the highest percentage of bribery rates. That's FSM and Kiribati. And then in contrast, Fiji has the lowest bribery rate at 5%. So that's quite an interesting variation. Then we asked about bribery rates by service, and it was fairly even spread across the different services we asked about, but probably the most in accessing government documents, at 29% of the respondents saying that they had to pay a bribe in accessing this service. Secondly, police, in accessing police services, and in comparison, least so in accessing education and health services. And then we asked about why they had to pay a bribe to receive these public services. The most common reason provided was to get a better or quicker service. So 47%, nearly half of the respondents regionally, had said that they paid a bribe in order to get a better or quicker service. Not so much that they were asked to pay a bribe or that they knew a payment was expected. Nor that they paid in order to express gratitude. So the main reason was to get a better or quicker service. It's really interesting to note. But there are, in addition to that, I guess, is that bribery is not often reported to authorities. Only, as in 13% of people who paid a bribe said that they reported it. So that's quite a low percentage. In addition to bribery, we also asked about the use of personal connections in accessing public services. 46% of the respondents said that they used personal connections at least once. So that's also a problematic area. And then the other question we asked was whether around reciprocity. So here, 37% felt that if a powerful person helps them, that they should reciprocate through gifts or votes. So this is quite concerning to see. Yes, so just looking just a little bit closer on the whole voting issue now. We asked about vote buying or bribes, being offered bribes to vote a certain way, and then threats to vote a certain way. And in both instances, we found out that it was quite problematic, with 26% of the respondents regionally saying that they were offered a bribe to vote a certain way at least once in the past 5 years, and that 15% have received a threat of retaliation if they did not vote a certain way. And then if you look at the country breakdown for vote buying, FSM and PNG has the highest percentages or most problematic. And in comparison, Fiji and Tonga are less so, at under 5%. And a similar trend in terms of best performers and worst performers are also seen around the question on threats to vote a certain way as well. And then we asked about sexual extortion in order to access essential services, sexual coercion. And essentially, we found out that this was a very concerning issue. 38% said that they've experienced extortion or know someone who has regionally. So that's quite a high number. And then 42% think that this happens at least occasionally. And then if you look at the country breakdown, French Polynesia has a really high, over 90% sextortion rate. And New Caledonia is also up there. PNG is quite problematic. But on the other side, still problematic, but much less in Tonga at 5%. So yeah, this issue really needs to be looked into. And if it is as grave as it is, urgent action needs to happen in response. So those were some of the experience questions, people's direct experiences. Now we're asking about people's attitudes towards corruption. And here, there is some positive news. People, even though people believe that corruption is an issue, they do believe that governments are doing a good job. So 62% of the respondents believe that governments are doing well in controlling corruption, particularly high in Kiribati at more than 80% of the respondents saying, yes, governments are doing well. Basically, almost all the countries except Fiji and Solomons, which is slightly under majority, said that governments are doing well. So that's really positive to see. It means we're on the right track, except more, I guess more needs to be done to make sure that these reforms result in low corruption rates. And then more positive news, we asked if people believe they can make a difference in fighting corruption. And here too, 71% regionally said yes. High across all countries, perhaps except New Caledonia. Really high, like over 80% in Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Vanuatu, where people here believe that they can make a difference. But in order to be part of the solution, they need to be included in decision making. And when asked about that, it turns out that people don't believe that governments frequently take their views into account. Regionally, only 14% think so. And if you see across the countries, generally the ratings are really low. So this really does need to be looked into to make sure that people are included meaningfully in decision-making processes. And then lastly, we asked about whether they believe governments were transparent in responding to the COVID crisis. Regionally, slightly more than half believe so, particularly high in Vanuatu, Kiribati, and Fiji. And in comparison, lower in the French territories. So we added this in the context of the pandemic, this question, and thought it would be useful. But the survey did take place in February and March of this year. So just note that it hasn't taken into account events since then. So those were some of the findings. We do have recommendations. They're broad and they cut across all the 10 countries and territories, but we really urge each country to look into their own specific findings, given that the findings are really varied across countries, and develop their own areas of focus responding to the findings. But broadly, this is what we have. Firstly, the report has shown that corruption is an issue and that urgent reform needs to take place, particularly now with the crisis, with the pandemic, where neglecting this issue could actually cost lives. And secondly, we found there are corruption, perceptions of corruption around towards political decision makers in particular. And so a broad recommendation here is to increase accountability of them. Third, we found that there are some corruption issues between how governments and businesses relate. And so this needs to be cleaned up, and the process in which they relate needs to be transparent, and proper processes need to be followed. Corruption in accessing public services are also an issue, as we have seen. So these specific issues need to be looked at. Processes in accessing public services need to be streamlined and made clear to all so that everyone can access it equally. Again, we found that there are some concerns around how voting is conducted. So, the electoral commissions in countries need to be strengthened, and people need to feel free to vote independently without fear or influence. And then we found out that people are really keen to be part of the solution in tackling corruption, but they need to be meaningfully involved. And so governments need to ensure that specific legislation around right to information and mechanisms to ensure freedom of expression are guaranteed in each country, so that people can access information and be part of the process. Media as well needs to be able to act independently and provide citizens information in a timely and accurate manner. So this framework really needs to support access to information and expression generally. Those were our recommendations. The full report is on the TI website. It's up there. The link is up there. Katy will put it up in the chat box as well. It does have country-specific findings as well in the report, so do look out for them. And just to say, what we are planning to do from here is we're really keen to speak to specific stakeholders, governments, intergovernmental bodies, media, just to provide more information, have discussions, and be part of the solution where we can. And particularly in countries where we don't have a national presence at the moment, we're really keen to explore partnerships with local CSOs so that we can engage with the findings in these countries as well. Yeah, so that's our plan. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments, do put them on the chat box, or you can also email myself or Julie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariam. That is absolutely amazing that you've uncovered quite a lot of information, and that Pacific people you've spoken to genuinely are concerned and want to be involved in any change. Can I just remind everyone the report's on Transparency International web page, and I think we've just posted the link here as well. So please read it. It provides lots of information, a lot of food for thought as well as our next steps. We're now just going into a Q&A session because our next speaker from Fiji, Joseph Veramu, we're just having some technical problems getting sorted, but hopefully he'll join us before the end of the session and will provide his contribution. But before I open up the floor to questions and answers, can I ask a question as well? So how long was the survey conducted for, Mariam? And you say with the 10, in fact, you surveyed 17 countries.
Yes. So the actual survey took place between February and March of this year.
Right.
Last year, a lot of work had gone into developing the questionnaire, making sure that it's context specific, that it's relevant to the Pacific context. So our chapters inputted into the survey, experts from the region as well inputted into the survey, the questionnaire, sorry. And then the questionnaire was translated into almost every national language as well, in order to ensure that when the survey was taking place, it was done effectively. But yes, the actual survey took place in February and March. I did mention that we surveyed 17 countries and territories. Yes. And this is essentially all the Pacific Island Forum countries and territories except for Australia and New Zealand. But this report, which we're launching today, only covers 10 of them, and the additional 7 will be released next year.
Great. And I've got a question here. What can local civil society organizations do with this data, this information? How do you hope that it can be used?
So we believe that it's a really powerful tool to hear from the people themselves. And what we are planning to do is to speak to local CSOs, civil society organizations, and have discussions around these findings. You know, what do they think of the findings? Any surprises there? Anything that's not surprising? You know, have they been working on some of these issues, and where do they think that we can all best place our efforts? So to have a bit more detail around in response to these initial findings. We do believe this is sort of the first step, but then now we need to have further discussions with key stakeholders, with governments, with other agencies, to understand what's being done, where are the gaps, and where should we all place our efforts. So that's going to be the next step. And we hope that through these partnerships that we seek out, that we can have these conversations at the national level across as many countries as ideally all the countries and territories that the report covers.
Great, okay, good. I have a question here. Given the, you may, well, in fact, I've got 2. One is, what was the impact of COVID on your surveying? Were you able to assess that?
So I guess how it impacted us was we conducted the survey largely on telephone in 9 out of the 10 countries. We weren't able to travel physically. Ideally, it would have been good for us to have both telephone but also face-to-face interactions with key populations, as we have done in other regions. We did, however, manage to have face-to-face interactions in FSM, but in all the other 9 countries and territories, it was all over the phone. But like I said, this is the first step. The borders are opening up, so it's not like we don't have that opportunity. That could still very well happen as a next step.
Right, and I've got a really good question. How often is the Barometer survey to be conducted?
It has been conducted, well, for the first time in the region, in the Pacific. The last time that some of the Pacific countries were included was in 2013. And that was only some of the countries, and it was part of the 2013 global report. So we are in the 10th edition, and we hope that as much as possible, we can continue to have these surveys done. Of course, hoping that there will be adequate funding as well in support of it. And next time we can do much more than telephone interviews. So just building on the results from here and being able to compare as well next year on, next time on.
Was there a conscious decision to not include New Zealand and Australia?
So our funding for this this project came from the Australian and New Zealand governments.
Right.
I have to say in the past that New Zealand and Australia have been included in previous global corruption barometers. And we hope that they will be covered in the consecutive ones as well. But with this specific edition, one, it was that the funding came from the Australian New Zealand governments towards overseas development aid, which meant that it would not be able to consider Australia and New Zealand themselves. But yeah, we hope that in the consecutive ones we will include them. This was the first time for the Pacific to be covered at such a large extent. So in a way, it's actually great that we are able to
Right.
to use the funding to actually have as many countries in the region as possible captured in the survey.
Great, thank you. I have a question here about Kiribati, which is included in this report. Given the Kiribati government has suddenly opened up its fishing around the Phoenix Islands without consultation from the minister or consent from the Minister of the Environment, what is the impact likely to be on trust and confidence in government from the people?
Well, we could speculate, but I mean, at the moment, the questions when we asked them did not go into specific sectors or contexts. It was very much the way the questions were phrased, and it could very well the findings or people's responses could be dependent on what's happening in those countries at that moment in time. But there's no way of really finding out beyond going back to the countries and having further conversations to see if there are trends, if there are linkages that can be made between events in countries and what the people have to say. But yeah, we wouldn't know for sure just based on this finding itself. Right.
I've got a statistical query. How are the people selected? How are they surveyed? And have you collected information about age group, employment, political affiliation, and other personal details?
So we apply a quota system, trying to ensure that key demographics were covered. So gender was considered, other sort of socioeconomic factors were considered, and we used the national census data to apply these quotas to. But as much as possible, we try to reach out to key populations, urban, rural, trying to have representation between both as well. So just to say that was captured as well. In terms of the quotas, in all the countries and territories except PNG and Fiji, the sample size we applied was 500 respondents, and then in Fiji and PNG it was 1,000, so slightly more.
Great, all right, thank you. Because a lot of these questions and the information you've gathered is around what the public service is doing or not doing or doing badly, did you survey any public service commissioners?
No, we did not survey other stakeholders. This is a people's survey, so we largely targeted the people themselves, ordinary people experiencing, that with their direct experience of corruption in their communities, to understand it firsthand. But yes, that is certainly a next step. We have broad recommendations in terms of being able to streamline services and make sure information is accessible to all, to ensure that everyone is able to access these services equally. But yeah, if we're able to have discussions with individuals, key governments as well, key sectors and governments, then we can have more in-depth discussions and find out where exactly, how detailed our reforms could be in responding to the situation in that specific country.
Right, thank you. Please keep sending your Q&As in so we can answer that. Is any progress with Joseph team? Is he how's our technical? Okay, all right. Let me just see what else I've got here. It's in the gender differences from each country.
So we have the raw data, by the way, not only the report will be published on the TI website, but the raw data as well, on across all the questions that we covered, looking into the specifics of the respondents themselves that answer these questions. So there's a lot more we can analyze from the data. For now, we haven't, I suppose we did not specifically apply a gender lens across every question, but that is certainly something that we can do in the next step, together with key allies, because the data is available, it has been collected, and now it's just about trying to analyze it and bring out these various specific dimensions of the data.
Oh, this is a tricky one, or much interesting. Does the survey indicate the CPI of these countries, and how are these countries placed in the CPI?
So the CPI, at the moment, the Corruption Perception Index, it's a slightly different survey. It's a survey of experts and business people, versus this is a people survey essentially. So I guess in simple language, that's the main difference between the two. Yeah, but it'd be interesting to have both of these tools applied across the same 10 countries and territories, to see interesting trends, between the two findings. At the moment, at least in the 2020 CPI, only some Pacific countries were covered, PNG, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu being the three. And yes, we really hope that we are able to cover more countries in the next CPIs to come. Ideally, all the Pacific countries.
Great. All right. Thank you. Now, is anyone? I'm just trying to go through my questions quickly. So, please keep sending your questions.
Fuimaono, it's Julie here. There's one in the chat which talks about the cultural, given the ability of Pacific development practitioners in New Zealand, what can they do to support the implementation of recommendations beyond sense making?
Julie, do you want to take that on?
Yeah. I think what we're asking hopefully is there's a number of people who are working in NGOs working across the Pacific, and there's another number of people working in Pacific development and business and linking through. There's a number of people attending who actually operate businesses across the Pacific. I think it's really just presenting the actual findings, so sharing the report and making sure that people are aware of what is actually the opinion of people on the ground. Just unmute. And then also, it's just picking up the recommendations and saying, well, if we are a part of this, if this is what's being recommended, how can these be shared with the government, and have those conversations? And I think that's the main thing they can do. It's a very rich it's a very rich resource to use. So I think there's a lot that they can do. Thanks.
Thank you. For everyone, that's Julie Haggie. She's the Chief Executive of Transparency International New Zealand. Thanks, Julie. I got it now. Did you ask the participants how well the anti-corruption institutions were performing? You've indicated that there's some problems, but the institutions that are dealing with these problems directly, how did you ask people what they thought about them?
No, not specifically the anti-corruption agencies. We asked broadly about corruption amongst individuals in key institutions. So it was actually at an individual level, and then broadly trust in key institutions to act responsibly. And there, government was sort of looked at as a broad category, as I showed in the slide. But that's certainly something we can follow up on post launch.
Oh, yes, well, this sort of follows on. There's another question. In the presentation, it was mentioned that 62% of respondents think their governments are doing well to address corruption. Did the survey include questions assessing perceptions towards the government as a whole, or was there a breakdown of perceptions to specific government entities? I think these are like government departments or agencies, and I can think of many that would be interested in the Auditor General's Office, the Department or the Ministry of Justice, the Ombudsman's Office, those types of oversight bodies. Was there a question that fleshed out this issue? Which government departments are doing better than others, or are you casting the net wide over all of government?
Yes, again, on that question, we asked about, we sort of were looking at questions which ordinary people would be able to relate to based on their everyday experience. And so we sort of phrase it as government as a broad category rather than getting too technical and trying to define key institutions and agencies. So it was government as a whole. But like I said, our next step now is to have discussions with CSOs in these countries, with various stakeholders, to build on these initial findings and see what it means for them. And if there are trends or patterns that develop from these further discussions, it could help us to narrow down where we should really place our efforts. And that's where there is opportunity to break down. When we say government, do we want to specifically ask about key agencies when we have meetings with CSOs or other key stakeholders? So that can certainly be done.
This is a hardy annual asked by most Pacific commentators. The question is, to what extent do cultural norms regarding the giving and receiving of gifts as part of cultural practices hide or open up corrupt practices? Was that part of the work?
Yes, so around people's direct experience with corruption in accessing public services, we did ask them if they felt the need to reciprocate if a person in power did them a favor through gifts or votes. So that's how we sort of phrased it, and the responses were concerning. We have the regional average, but we also have the country breakdowns, which you will see in the report. And here too, it's we have to contextualize the findings and look at in the context of Tonga or Samoa, how problematic is it, and how much should we actually look at it as a corruption problem and then respond to it accordingly. But what we have right now is what the people say, and we can build on that.
Great, thank you very much. Friends, we have our technical problems resolved with Fiji, and now we have Joseph Veramu, who will speak to us. Bulavinaka, kia ora. Joseph, thank you for joining us. You are now live on Regional Pacific Internet. Joseph, before you speak, let me introduce you. And the reason why Joseph has been asked to contribute is because he's right in the middle of it all, right in the middle of the Pacific in Fiji. Dr. Joseph Veramu is the Executive Director of Integrity Fiji, a national contact for Transparency International in the Pacific based in Suva. He's previously a lecturer and campus director at USP and has worked for the United Nations, including the UNDP and UNICEF in Fiji and regionally. He's an active board member across government bodies and community-based organizations, and he brings a wealth of experience and knowledge about integrity issues in the Pacific. Welcome, Joseph. Welcome, Bula. We will now turn our attention to you, and we greet you. And just so that you know, we have we have lots of people here very interested in the subject and now very interested to hear what you have to say. Greetings.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm so terribly sorry for the delays. We were sort of rushing around for the launch here, and so excited about the GCB. As you know, we don't have this much data that's coming that is very comprehensive as the Global Corruption Barometer Pacific. And it's also a chance for us to be able to work with governments and the public to sort of advocate on anti-corruption. The results for Fiji are heartening in some ways, comparatively better than perhaps other countries. Although we do see that it is still problematic because the fight against corruption is never ending. And in a way, no time to slow the pace on advocacy or litigations in the courts. So basically the point is sometimes the Fijian mentality is, okay, let's rest on our laurels. So we have sort of achieved this. So that we are trying to make to governments and everyone, the public, is that corruption is never ending and we should continue with it. We were surprised that 83% of respondents in Fiji agreed that ordinary people can make a difference in the fight against corruption. And we're surprised also that 56% agreed that the government is doing a good job in fighting corruption. Although I understand that this is slightly lower than the Pacific average of 62%. Yeah? But the way we look at Fijian respondents, they are very receptive. We can work with them, mobilize them to fight corruption, and we think that's a good thing. Yeah? People in Fiji, I suppose it is that 13% of respondents say that the government did not listen to their views. And so this is an area perhaps of improvement because people are passionate about their country and believe that they are part of the narrative. They need to feel that on the boat, that are also not just but healthier. That's basically what we want, that people should be able to be used, to work together with governments, with the private sector and the CSOs to make this happen, to work to combat corruption. In conclusion, I would just like to acknowledge the great work that has been done by Transparency International New Zealand in Fiji, in setting up the Integrity Fiji. They have just been fantastic. And the support of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also the work we has become about 2 months ago. We are just so thankful with New Zealand for all the help and support. And I would say today that I'm not sure if you can see young people getting ready for this. The Prime Minister is coming, the Minister of Economy, UNDP, the US Embassy, and I have been asked by the youth leader to convey their deepest appreciation to TI New Zealand. You probably noticed that from the way I'm talking that I'm a former school teacher, so we tend to go on and on talking. So Chair, I'll stop there now.
All right, thank you. We can carry on listening to your commentary for a while longer. One of the things that came up was asked is, did COVID affect the responses? What's your perception about, did COVID early this year affect the response to the survey?
Yes, my understanding is that this survey was done before the COVID hit the country and the lockdowns. Yes. And there have been some restrictions on speech and on movements. Yes. But I understand that it seems to be a worldwide thing. But for us, because we are trying to get more democracy, it probably affected it a bit, the sense that we had to be careful because of restrictions that are in place because of that. But it's too early to sort of make any more substantive comments. I just thought that the COVID sort of affected the
All right. Joseph, just so that you know, we have a Q&A link here for anyone who wants to ask a question of you and your work in Fiji. So can I just encourage anyone who's interested in what's happening in Fiji. It's great to hear that you've got a lot of officials coming to the launch of the report in Suva, from the big man to other officials, and so it's good to know that it's being officially recognised as an important piece of work that's being recognised here in your gathering. We've only got another 5 minutes, and so I'm just going to ask if anyone's got any further questions to let us know. Joseph's online. I suppose one of the follow-up questions I have is what is the next steps? What is the next steps for this report? So maybe Mariam and Joseph, if you've got any comments to make in that space, I really appreciate to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I'll start off first. I think we now have developed our strategies based on GCE. I think the GCB have got a lot of the point issues that we can look at and sort of try to break through the strategies. And we will be working closely with Katy and Mariam, and of course Transparency International New Zealand in working on this. We think this partnership is just fantastic for us. And let me just say that New Zealand is sort of the first in the CPI, and we are just 3 hours away from here to New Zealand. So it's something as a reference point also for our leaders. Corruption that to be on the CPI, it's not hard. If there are strong democratic institutions, strong integrity pillars, then we can achieve this. Much.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. And Mariam?
Yes. Yeah, just to conclude from my side as well, to say that we're really happy to be able to contribute this report, the findings across such a large number of countries across the region, and hope it's going to be not the last, but the first of many such reports that we are able to provide to the anti-corruption movement in the region, to leaders, the governments, and other key stakeholders. And we have found out from the people themselves that there are some concerning issues. Corruption is a problem, and specific areas as well where they have said that corruption is an issue. So yes, while governments are doing a good job, we've seen that more needs to be done urgently in response to these findings, to make sure that corruption actually ends up reducing in the region. And we look forward to working with governments and other stakeholders in being part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, look, that brings us to an end to our session. Thank you for joining us, Joseph, and thank you, Mariam, for your presentation. And to all, our report is available on Transparency International website. You can see that in big Pacific gatherings that Joseph is being involved in. I think it's going to be an amazing event there. And unfortunately, we can't do something similar like that here in Aotearoa. But there is something in common, Joseph, that New Zealand, Australia, Fiji, Samoa, and the Tongan nations have suffered. Going to Europe, our rugby teams have all been beaten. So we have something else in common, my friend. Oh, you've got some people there to say hello.
Our youth just want to use Julie and Mariam, Katy, and all the. Okay.
Well, thank you. Nice to see you. Have a great event. Okay. Have a great event. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for being part of this session. We'll leave it at that. So farewell, go well, and keep the struggle up. We can continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you.
Ula.